So this is my recipe for how to make a very easy deconstructed pot pie. I have all the ingredients over here. I have probably about 9 ounces of chicken that's shredded, about 8 ounces of frozen mixed vegetables, about 4 ounces of frozen onion and 4 ounces of celery, about 1.5 tablespoons of butter, same amount of flour, and 2 cups of chicken stock. The first thing you want to do is you want to set your pie dough out to get room temperature. I usually do that when I set my oven on 450 and let it be out while it's preheating. So once it's pliable, you just roll it out. I use parchment paper over a pizza pan, and then you want to make sure that you put some holes in it just so that it aerates, and then you pop it in the oven. That usually is about 9 minutes, or whatever the directions say. Sometimes you may want it to be a little bit darker, but we'll do that in a minute. I have my pan on about medium-high heat, and I'm going to add some oil, any kind that you want. I'm using olive oil, but just a really light coating because all I'm doing right now is warming up the veggies. So if you're using fresh vegetables, you want to make sure that you put the celery and or carrots in first because they will need to cook a little bit longer. So once your pan is hot and you get those going, then you just let them cook until they're a little bit soft. The celery's been cooking for about 2.5 minutes. You can really start to smell it, and it's getting a little brown on the edges. So the next thing that you do is you add your frozen vegetables. I usually start with the onions first and let them start to cook down a little bit. You want them to be relatively translucent, maybe even a little bit brown, because color equals flavor. At least that's what they say. And once those get a little translucent, probably only a minute or so, you toss in the rest of the frozen vegetables. I always keep my containers on hand in case I want to add a little bit more. That looks like a little bit too few vegetables for me, so I'm going to add some more. Just eyeball it however much you think you want in there. It also depends on if you want it to be more saucy or less saucy. I tend to have less sauce and more veggies, but that's just a personal preference. Then again, you just kind of wait for these guys to get a little bit warmed through. You'll know that they're warmed through when you have bright colors on all of them. So the veggies are warmed up a little bit. They're going to cook a little bit more in the sauce. And you can see we have 4 minutes left on the pie crust, now 3 minutes. And that's probably about how much time you're going to have left on just cooking this whole thing together. The next thing I do is I add the butter and just let it melt down. Make sure that all of the veggies get covered in the butter. That takes a little bit of time to do, but well worth your while. Then the next thing you do is once the butter is mostly melted or all the way melted, you just sprinkle your flour evenly over all of your veggies. And then you're going to want to stir that around until your flour gets a light brownish color, which means that you're basically making a roux. So if you know how to make macaroni and cheese, you're doing a macaroni and cheese type roux, but you're just putting them on top of all the veggies. Okay, the next thing you do is you pour in your stock. I use Better Than Bouillon usually. This is a store-bought stock because I didn't have any Better Than Bouillon. And then you basically just pour it over and make sure you're getting up all that good flour bits off the bottom. If you want it to be saucier, you add more stock. If you want it to be less saucy, you can add less. And then this is when I would go ahead and add the chicken also, because you want it to get warmed through. And then you just let that sit and bubble until it gets as thick as you want it. It will get a little bit thicker as it cools.
Saucy, yeah.
So you just kind of wait on that. I'm going to take a peek at the pie crust. It's still a little bit blonde for me, so I'm going to add at least another minute, maybe 2, and I'll show you what that looks like when it comes out. I turned the chicken down while I was waiting for the pie crust to come out. The pie crust is done. This is about the color that I like it, but it's really up to you what you decide. So ultimately, this is going to be like napalm right now, so you probably want to wait for a little bit of time for it to cool off. But what I usually do is, they say 1/8 of this is a serving, but that's not really true. So I usually do 1/4 of it for me, and usually a little bit more for Mike. And what I do is I cut it up, and then I put some on the bottom, and then I scoop in. Ouch, that's really hot. I'll put some on the bottom and break it up a little bit, and then I scoop the chicken pot pie in on top, and then I put a little bit more on top. Sometimes I crumble it, sometimes I leave it whole, but that's it. A couple of things you may want to know is if you want a thicker sauce, you may want to use a little bit more flour and butter. And if you want to saute your chicken, go ahead and do that first, and then pull that out of the pan and do all the vegetable stuff and put the chicken back in, because then it won't overcook. That's it. Enjoy!